Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Russell Goldborn. I'm a professor of French literature and the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Humanities here at King's. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to this evening's lecture, which forms part of our 7th annual Arts and Humanities Festival. So thank you all very much indeed for coming. Thank you to Anna's friends, family, colleagues. A particular thank you to Professor Molly Andrews, Professor of Sociology at the University of East London, who will be giving the vote of thanks at the end of today's lecture. And after that, there will be a reception in chapters. So if you head upstairs, there'll be drinks afterwards. Today, as I'm sure you're all aware, is the day when Doc Brown sent Marty McFly back to the future, 21st of October, 2015. So much hasn't happened as we or they thought it would. I'm afraid I didn't come here today on a hoverboard wearing self-tied shoes. But other things have happened that even Doc Brown could never have imagined. For instance, Times Higher Education has today published its latest World University Rankings for Arts and Humanities, in which we at King's have risen from 23rd in the world to 15th, and from 5th in the UK to 4th. Yay, there we go. Very good. I'll pay you later. So today is a day for thinking about the future as well as the past. And I think then there could be no better day for this inaugural lecture, a story of memory, to be delivered by Professor Anna Reading, Professor of Culture and Creative Industries here at King's. It's a particular pleasure for me to introduce Anna this evening, as she is one of the first colleagues I met here at King's when I was being considered for this position as Dean just over 2 years ago. I'd been invited to interview, and a couple of weeks beforehand, I was invited for an informal visit to the college to meet a few colleagues, the kind of informal visit that actually, with hindsight, was probably terribly formal. One of the colleagues I met was Anna. So I paid my first visit to the Chesham building, got a first sense of the space that we occupy in this faculty. Anna had done her homework. She'd read my blog and had comments to make about it. We had a really interesting and enjoyable conversation. And I thought then, as I do now, that this is a colleague whom I would and do really like working with. And I think for 3 reasons. Firstly, she's an intellectual who sees that the life of the mind is best lived as part of the life of the body and the life of the soul. Secondly, she's a university academic who puts people before process, who exemplifies empathy, that defining characteristic for me of the arts and humanities disciplines. And thirdly, she's not just an intellectual and an academic, but a person with lots of other interests and talents too, a playwright, a storyteller, an activist in the fullest sense of the term, a woman to whom family is fundamental. So it's an honor for me to count Anna as a colleague and a privilege for me to introduce her lecture. Anna is, as I've already mentioned, Professor of Culture and Creative Industries here at King's. She joined us in 2013 from the University of Western Sydney, where she had been Professor of Communication. Before that, she had taught at London South Bank University and had been a researcher at the University of Westminster. Educated at the University of York, Anna initially trained and worked as a freelance journalist in Poland and the UK before completing a PhD on memory, gender, and the public sphere in Poland at the University of Westminster. That PhD pointed the way in many senses to her future work, which has effectively defined and is defining the developing field of cultural and media memory studies, especially in terms of gender and cultural memory. the author of 3 books, the editor of a further 3, as well as being the chair of the editorial board of the journal Media, Culture and Society. Anna is an internationally celebrated authority in the study of cultural memory, where she is currently developing new ways of thinking about media memory by using dynamic methods of digital analysis. I'm sure her lecture this evening will take us back to the future in a whole new way. Anna.
Very much, Russell, for that really wonderful introduction, and a huge welcome to everybody here. It's just an extraordinary audience because I know a lot of you, and it's probably an audience that I will never have the pleasure of speaking to in quite this way ever again. So thank you very much for coming. My grandmother's generation were aged 9 and 11 when suffrage was won for women in the UK, which was about 100 years ago, as I'm sure you're aware. So this lecture, as Russell suggests, is aptly meant as both a commemoration of that and also a celebration of the continued struggle that we have ahead of us. And before I begin, I would just like to thank many of you in the audience for coming here tonight. So I have friends here from the University of York. I have my teachers here from my comprehensive school who sent me on the journey of thinking about history and politics. And I wouldn't have done that, actually, without them. I have colleagues here from the various places in which I've worked, and I have colleagues from King's who I so enjoy working with. I have some wonderful students from the past who I've taught, and I have students here who I currently teach, who are also just wonderful. And then I have people from the various studies, media studies, gender studies, cultural studies, and so on. And I would like to extend a warm welcome also to the people who I've met kind of just beforehand, who've come to the lecture out of general interest, because this is here as part of the festival. So a really warm welcome to you too, and I look forward to speaking to some of you at the reception. A big thank you to my PhD students and to my colleagues in CMCI who helped decorate this theatre, okay? I looked up professorial inaugural, and lots of men in grey suits came up. And I thought, I had a kind of costume panic. I thought, I don't have a grey suit, what am I going to do? And then I thought, I don't have to do it like that. I can do it in the way that I want to, and I just wanted to kind of break the space a little bit. And we'll have some wonderful sound art just a little bit later. You had some as we came in, and I would like to really thank Sarah Kent, who's up in the corner here, making amazing noises at the beginning and some wonderful noises further along into the lecture as well. I would really like to thank my family as well, who are down here, who've come to join us. And I would like to thank my mum, Ellen, who's just driven up from Dorset to look after our 2 children, who will feature in the lecture, you'll see, as we go along. And finally, the biggest thanks goes to Dr. Colin Harvey, my partner and husband, who I wouldn't be standing here doing what I do today without his love and his support. So a huge thank you to you, Colin. So, what on earth am I going to talk about? Well, this is it, okay? Cave woman, it'll become evident in a minute, okay? And then I'm going to talk about imagining kind of gendered memories, and then I'm going to outline a little bit to do with memory studies, because I'm aware that, you know, I know about memory studies, but there's lots of people in the audience for whom maybe this might be something new. It's a bit like media studies, you know, what on earth is memory studies? So can it get you a job, for example? It might not. We'll see. And then memory studies in the globital age, which is something I've kind of invented. And then examples from some recent research. And some of the research I'm going to cite, there are people in the audience who contributed to that research, which was research in South London primary school with parents in that school. So a big thank you for you too for coming to this particular lecture. Now, a strand of my work since I lived and worked in Australia has concerned rock art. And I mean, primarily in thinking about kind of 40,000-year-old rock art in Australia and its destruction by mining companies. And tracing the commodity chain then that leads to the colour red that you see on the screen here, which is produced by the rare earth europium. Now, I'm not going to talk about that now, actually. I'm going to talk about the gendering of rock art. And this is a rock art site that I visited recently. It's the Himmelstallen rock carvings on the outskirts of Norrköping in Sweden. And this is a camera phone image that I took myself, hence poor quality, but that's how I do my research. I use my camera phone. And it was at 11 p.m. and it's in June, so the sun is still up and hot. And this was an amazing site with the grooves of what you could see were boats, ships that would have taken the dead into their next life. And there was a whole plethora of rock carvings there out in the open. And then I went to the museum and this is an image of a 3D animation in a museum. And what interested me was, in terms of digitality, what was chosen to be rendered into 3D. And in a sense, you could say, well, this is the dramatic moment. This is the killing of the woolly bison, or whatever the creature is, okay? And it's being killed by two men with a spear, okay? And the rest of the rock art we didn't see rendered in the museum. Then I went to the next room, and there were lots of beautiful looms, and as there should have been within Norrköping, because it's a city in which weaving was very important, and it noted that women were key to weaving. And I was reminded at that point by Sigmund Freud. Okay? Now, I don't know if you know this lovely fantasy of Sigmund Freud's, but I'm going to try and act this bit out, okay? I won't do the accent very well, but I'll try, okay? So, it seems that women have made few contributions to the discoveries and inventions in the history of civilization. There is, however, one technique which they may have invented, that of plaiting and weaving. If that is so, we should be tempted to guess the unconscious motive for the achievement. Nature herself would seem to have given the model which this achievement imitates by causing the growth at maturity of the pubic hair that conceals the genitals. The step that remained to be taken lay in making the threads adhere to one another, while on the body they stick to the skin and are only matted together. If you reject this idea as fantastic, no, really? And regard my belief in the influence of a lack of a penis on the configuration of femininity as an idea fixe, I am, of course, defenceless. So that's Femininity, Sigmund Freud, new introductory lectures, one like this, on psychoanalysis. It kind of puts you off psychoanalysis, doesn't it, really? Well, then I was reminded of Alistair MacIntyre's work, Moral Philosopher. And he says, and in my view quite rightly, stories and memories of stories are important, as the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre argues. He says, deprive children of stories and you leave them unscripted, anxious stutterers in their actions as in their words. And now he says this really without any sense of irony, in that all of the people that he quotes are male authors with predominantly male protagonists in the stories. So what happens then to boys and men who are routinely denied stories of girls and women over thousands of years, in which they only see themselves as the protagonists? What happens to a society What has this done to our sons, to our brothers, to our fathers? And what happens when girls and women are routinely denied stories of girls and women over thousands of years, and predominantly see boys and men as the protagonists? And how, and this is the question I've been kind of looking at more recently, are digital technologies replicating these processes, or are they providing, as we're led to believe, something a little bit different? This is another kind of rock art. I am the woman, the warning, hiss, fleshy moss, verdant by brown clag. I drip, drip, a million years, form in icicles by moonlight. My oak roots gape the darks. These you do not see, unless respectfully you enter. This is rock art too. This is around the same age. It is a rock womb. It's not an accident, it was made. There was a little cave there to begin with, and it was carved out further. It's at Podaci in Bulgaria, and over the past 3 years, 3 more of these have been rediscovered by the archaeologist Nikolai Orkachov. And what's then interesting is that we can find these images so easily on that wonderful thing called the internet. Just Google womb cave and see what you get. So what happens then if we begin to think about history and memory in a different way and begin to imagine the impossible? Now, all of you, when you came in, were welcomed with one of these. Okay, this is, I shouldn't really say my favourite, but I kind of picked this one out for myself. Okay. Yeah. Many of them were hand knitted. Okay, thank you, Jessica. They were handmade by staff from across Kings. Thank you very much. There was one of my PhD students' grandmother who sent, I think, 6 or 8, thank you very much, from Poland. Okay, and there are people presently knitting these moon bags in Western Australia and South Australia as part of a movement to make moon bags to put what we'll see, future memories in. Okay, so hold on to your moon bag. You're going to go on a little journey before we go on to the kind of the next bit of the lecture. And I'm just going to quickly explain why. The sociologist Ruth Levitas in Utopia's method says that when we're at the start of learning something new, it's really important that we think about imagining the impossible in some way. She's drawing on the sociologist's work, C. Wright Mills, but she's also, it seems to me, referencing the work of people like Emily Keatley and Michael Pickering in the mnemonic imagination, which brings together ideas about memory and imagination. And this exercise that we're going to do is also very much indebted to Dr. Jessica Rapson's work on the idea of future memory and Red Chidgey's work on ideas of feminist memory. And they're here with us today because they're within CMCI. They're part of this movement for thinking about these aspects of memory. I want you to imagine then that you are living in 2,000 years' time. And I want you to imagine that a revolution took place 1,000 years ago. And at that moment, in that revolution, which took a long time, equality, full gender equality was established. And after the gender revolution, as it then became known, it was not a matriarchy that was then established, or a patriarchy, it was something that we don't have a word for, which is a mapatriarchy. Okay, let's call it that. Okay, men and women hold equal office, they hold equal lands, they're equally commemorated, they are seen in equal measure in the news and in books and in monuments, and the number of women scientists equal the number of men scientists, and the number of amazing women artists equal the number of well-known male artists. Gender is not seen to be irrelevant, but it is seen as something essential, but not a hindrance or a burden. The skin you're born into does not burn with shame. Girls are not made to disappear. Now, in this future imaginary, when you look back, you are able to think of lots of examples of amazing women. Because remember, the gender revolution happened 1,000 years ago. Okay? So you are invited now just to relax for a moment. You probably rushed here. I had lots of texts from people saying, oh, I'm going to be late. You know, okay, just relax for a minute and settle into the place and space of here, which is full of memories, and allow Sarah Kent, who's going to do some sound to take you into that place and space. You don't have to do or think anything for the time being, okay? so now take your pen, which you should find in front of you, and your piece of paper, and just write down the name of a future woman from the past. Here's one I made earlier. Just do your own in the way that you wish. So a name and a date of birth in 1,000 years' time or so, and a job or something that she's done that's remembered to be amazing. It could be an invented job. I invented a job called neurophysicist, somebody who studies the nerves of the universe. Okay, you don't have to labour over it. Once you've done it, just fold it up and put it in your moon bag. That is your keepsake, your memory of the future. And maybe after this lecture, you might feel like taking a photograph of your moon bag and your suggested person, imagined woman, and emailing me the image. And then if you want me to, I can put it onto a website and we can collect them together. And there would be about 200 imaginary women from this place. Okay? So that's just a little bit of fun, really. I want to then just explain what memory studies is all about, very briefly, and where it comes from for people who are kind of maybe haven't thought about memory studies. Memory studies comes from a variety of different disciplines. History, I would say, is probably predominant, but lots of other areas and disciplines across the arts and humanities, media and cultural studies, but also biology and the medical sciences, computer science and digital humanities, geography, archaeology, film. I'm sure I've missed some out, and museum studies, okay? And it brings these together. And then what it creates is this, okay? That's a field, a muddle together. And that's probably why I enjoy working in this field, okay? Because it allows me to cross over. It's very, very transdisciplinary. What does then the mnemologist, and I love this word, because when I was at university, I found I didn't have a word for myself. I would have people coming up to me and saying, hello, my name's Squeezy and I'm a biologist. And I'd say, well, I don't know what I am. I kind of study English and politics and lots of different things, okay? So I'm now a mnemologist. Doesn't quite work, but never mind. And what the mnemologist studies is personal and autobiographical memory, public and collective memory, museums, archives, trials, commemorative practices, cultural and media memory. And I like to think that the people who do memory studies do useful things in the world, in that we think about how to create social cohesion after conflict, after trauma, after atrocity. Certainly a lot of my work has been doing that with museums, with archives and so on around the world. And then also, some of us do stuff in memory studies to think about how to create social change and how to draw on earlier struggles to think about social change. And I think a lot of the work that we do within memory studies is also then about thinking about personal community and social inclusion. Now, the work that I've done more recently over the past 5 years or so is really thinking about the ways in which memory comes together through digitization and globalization. I think of memory as both energetic and material, and it's the coming together of those elements across different materialities that may be organic, they may be mineral, they may be vegetal, to misquote Umberto Eco. And with the combination of globalization and digitization, we're getting something very different, it seems to me, within the 21st century when we begin to think about how memory is working in relation to human beings. And what I've suggested is that what we have now is memory in the globital age. And when as an academic you can't quite kind of figure out how something works, you make up a word, or at least I do. That's you know, having good training in literature does that, it seems to me. So globital is this combination of global with bit, which is the smallest contiguous sequence of data. And it's a mashing of the two things together. And the word is designed to be deliberately difficult to say. It sticks in your gut, or in your throat. Globital, okay? And the reason it does that, it's difficult to say, is because it is uneven. The process of globitalization, the process of memory in the globital age is uneven, because capitalism means that the distribution of wealth and the distribution of digitization and globalization is uneven. And so the globital memory field is therefore uneven. This is my daughter, by the way. I made her do this on holiday. Isn't that awful of me? I said I need a slide that says globital. I made her do it 3 times. It's awful. The tide was coming in as well. Anyway. I also then wanted to kind of find a methodology or develop a methodology that moved away from what I perceive to be static, fixed methodologies that tend to be associated particularly with the social sciences, that tend to dissect up the world, that tend to fix them. Because in a world of globalization, in a world of globalization and digitization, things are on the move, as John Urey says, more than ever. And so the social scientists, the people in humanities, the neurologist needs to be able to track movement and change. And what I discovered in a kind of series of different case studies was that actually there's 6 trajectories that are important to think about. And the first is transmediality, and that's the ways in which the memory assemblage, that's the different bits that are kind of glued together around the memory, travel and change across different media. The second then is in terms of velocity and tracing the speed with which memories might travel. So more and more you might digitally witness something and send it to your friend through Facebook or through a mobile phone very rapidly, okay? But there's also slow spots as well. It's not the case that memories always travel very quickly. It depends who you are, where you are, what access you have to digital technologies. And it also depends on the kind of traction that the memory has in all sorts of other ways. There's also then the question of extensity and the kind of reach that a globital memory assemblage might have in different ways around the world. Then there's the modality, and I'll just flip here to using a concrete example because it's probably the most difficult to kind of explain. The example of modality is that increasingly with digitization and globalization, it's easy to make the modality of something, the kind of protocols and codes that govern how a memory is, if you like, change much more rapidly. So if you think about a sonogram or sonograph, it's taken for a medical purpose, but then increasingly these kinds of images, and this is my son, by the way, but a long time ago, he wants you to know that he is now 10, okay? He's here, okay? He's not that big. He said, okay, you can use the image if you tell them. And he wanted you also to know that he chose my dress. So this image, okay, which is taken then as a medical image with that protocol, then becomes a social image. And it's become a social image here. I can easily share it in a way that I could not have hitherto. I could not share the inside of my womb of the growing fetus with you without digitization. So that modality is easy to change. And then there's valency, and for those of you who know chemistry, you'll know that means the kind of sticky bits, the bits that kind of stick together. But memories have sticky bits too. And the stickier they are, it seems to me, the more likely they are to gain dominance within the public sphere, and also within families and within personal memories too. And then there's viscosity. And that's to do with the way in which the memory assemblage has resistance to flow or to change. So that's the kind of theoretical bit, okay, if you like. We're going to move on in a minute to thinking about some more concrete examples. But by way of kind of getting into that bit, I just want to explain that this recent research that I'm doing that's due to come out in a book next year is looking particularly at the ways in which new media or memory technologies are changing memory in various different ways. And it's not that, you know, I'm the first to necessarily think about this. I'm kind of building on the work of many earlier people who thought about technologies in various different ways, but not necessarily specifically around memory. So Marshall McLuhan, Walter J. Ong, for example, talked about memory, but not in terms of its gendering. They weren't particularly interested in its gendering. People who have thought about memory and its gendering was Gerdjian Yonkers, who talked about the topography of remembrance and sort of outlines the ways in which gender then became an important factor in the ways when papyrus came in, and that women then began to be marginalised at public shrines in Mesopotamia. So you see the technology of papyrus then becomes important to the technologies of gender and memories of gender. Harold Weber's really interesting book, Memory, Print and Gender in England, looks at the ways in which the switch from the manuscript to the book then led to new kinds of genderings of memory and memories of gender, and the kind of greater marginalisation of women within public culture. So I was curious then, or I am curious, about the ways in which within a culture of digitisation, a culture of the mobile phone, of social technologies, how is that changing human memory? And how is it changing the gendering of memory and the memories of gender? And I've tried to do that by thinking about, first of all, the imaginary, and I had the pleasure of reading lots of science fiction books to do that. I'm not going to talk about that bit today. And then I thought, well, it's really important to think about the ways in which memory is now in the body, okay? This sense in which medical imaging in particular is rendering new kinds of memories from the interior of our bodies in new kinds of ways. And then the ways in which memory technologies within the globital age are changing memories within the home. And then finally within the public domain. And I'm going to concentrate primarily on the body and the home, because I think that that's particularly important in terms of changing how memory is working. It's kind of blurring the boundaries between public and private, the ways in which mobile and social technologies are kind of linking the public and private in various different ways. So we're going to just spend a little bit of time now thinking about the body and birth. And as I said at the beginning, my own grandmothers were born without a vote. And one of my grandmothers was an only child because her father died, but the other one had 7 children who survived beyond the age of 5 out of 11 that were born. And at the same time as the struggle for suffrage 100 years ago, there was also the struggle for maternity rights, and that's often marginalised in our cultural memories of those particular events. But that was incredibly important, particularly to working class women. So by way of contrast, I just want to read a little bit to you from Maternity, Letters from Working Women, which is a collection of letters that women wrote before the First World War in order to campaign for better maternity rights, or some maternity rights, within Britain. I have had 4 children, and all were born 1.5 years after each other. My 2 eldest died in 1 week from whooping cough, aged 5 and 3. 2 of my children were stillborn. I was very young at the time, and I only wish this maternity scheme had come out years ago. I have a good husband, but we are childless, I'm sorry to say. I'm on many committees and I take a great interest where children are concerned. Now, in these letters, women frequently express isolation, anxiety, and then a sense of hope, but also a slight sense of shame at passing on their stories. I do hope I have not done wrong in relating so much of my past, and that it may be of some use in the furthering of our scheme. The kind of pain involved in the passing on of that story, it seems to me, is tangible. How different then, in the 21st century, in the globital age, companies such as BabyView ultrasound scans offer to mothers and fathers to be a number of packages that can be purchased with a variety of medical procedures. This includes fetal sexing as well as imaging of the unborn. One feedback says, "Phenomenal experience. Now I know what she's up to in there. Such a beautiful baby, shown to us by fantastic staff. Fab gel too. We cannot thank you enough." I don't know why it is, they always go on about the gel being important. Terrible. Now, national statistics on imaging and radiodiagnostic examinations carried out in the NHS in England show that in between 2011 and 2012, there were 9.3 million ultrasound tests for obstetric purposes. Now, the sonogram developed primarily to detect fetal differences from what's perceived to be or constructed as the norm, but it's also now increasingly used to detect the sex of the baby. Now, prior to this, there were all sorts of techniques for detecting the sex of a baby. One of my favourites, which is from the Distaff Gospels of the 15th century, a French century text, recommends, for example, that the father creep up to the pregnant woman, sprinkle salt over her face, and then depending on the name that she utters when she wakes up, presumably something like, "What the hell are you doing?" That will then say what sex the baby is, okay? Now, all of those kinds of techniques, of course, were always 50% right, which was brilliant. But they were also processes that were not recorded at all, really, through external means or any kinds of memory technologies. And soon after the birth, the imagined sex of the baby would soon be forgotten. Now, feminist scholars have said all sorts of things about the impact of sonography, because it's been with us now for several decades, and there has been concern about the ways in which this extends the gestation to gestation, the Hobbesian view of the human being as disconnected and a solitary individual. Anne Oakley, for example, said that giving birth to a boy is very different from knowing that you have a boy growing inside of you. But more recent work suggests that with the sonograms such as this, and with the kind of work that private companies are doing, that actually there's a kind of pleasure to having the image of your fetus. And perhaps there is. But there's something there that is forgotten. That's the inside of my womb. Okay? Just up there, there is also holding that image, holding that baby, there is the mother. Okay? And when we look at that image, we don't think about that. We don't speak it really in company. It's kind of because it kind of hints at something else that happened, which we'd rather not think about, particularly not in relation to the professor standing at the front. Okay? And so there's something there that is then marginalised again and silenced in relation to this digital image in all sorts of ways. But there's also something even more sinister, it seems to me. In China now, 118 boys are born for every 100 girls, against a global average of 103 to 107. The number of females per 1,000 males in India, in Haryana in 2011, stands at 879, and so you see the difference that's emerging here. So fetal scanning then is also leading to a new kind of gender scanning. A new kind of gender side, in that what you can do, if you can see the sex of your baby, is if she's female, you can get rid of her at that point. And there's relatively little memory then of that. With female infanticide, you might at least have the bones. With this method, there is nothing once the fetus is flushed down the sewers or burnt in the incinerator. And yet, maybe there's also another side to this too. And what I'm saying is that it's complicated, the ways in which digital technologies are rendering gendered memory and memories of gender. This is a sonograph of a molar pregnancy. Now, a molar pregnancy is, and it's fairly rare, so it's about 1 in 1,000. But with a molar pregnancy, what happens is the placenta begins to go a bit mad, okay? It doesn't have a pattern like this, and it just keeps stitching. And the libidinal force of life just keeps going on. And it's actually quite beautiful in a strange kind of way. This is a colour image of a molar pregnancy. Now, before the sonogram, women would have just kept going, bigger and bigger, would have looked pregnant, and would have got sicker and sicker, and they'll all likelihood develop into trophoblastic disease and cancer. Or the woman would have been defined as mad because she looked pregnant but she didn't have a baby, phantom pregnancy. Okay? And so this technology also prevents that from happening. So ultrasonic technologies then are changing in some ways the gendering of memory and the memories of gender. I'm going to move on now to just moving out of the body to thinking about not inside the body, but what happens when we have technologies that are close to the body. And I'm going to draw here on a couple of studies that I've done about 6 or 7 years apart, one in 2006 and one in 2015. And these involved interviews with people to do with their mobile phone use and how they were using them as memory prosthetics. And the more recent work, as I said, is drawing on research with parents of primary school age children, as well as then students at King's. So there was a sample of those who we might define as digital born, and those who, like me, are a digital migrant, who have kind of, fumblingly got used to using digital technologies in the course of my lifetime. Now, what's really interesting, it seems to me, about this is that some of the results seem to confound some things that I thought would be fairly evident. Particularly the digital natives seem to be having, or digital born, seem to be having a rebellion against the digital in terms of the kinds of things that they would seek to record, and seeing as intrusive the level of what they perceive to be surveillance through mobile and social technologies. So one woman, for example, said, "I just don't find it very compelling to put every meal that you've eaten out there. I mean, who cares? I think it's way too much oversharing on the internet. Look at me, I'm having such a good time." Okay? And that kind of confounded what I thought would be the case, actually. And it goes against fairly recent research as well by Rosalind Gill, who talks about self-surveillance as being important to the current generation of women. That was not the case in the research that I conducted. Rather, women seemed to be rebelling against it. And I thought that that was really interesting as in terms of one of the results. Now, what's interesting about the mobile phone too is that it's not, unlike any other ICT technology, it allows you to leapfrog over other technologies. So in countries that have very little landline penetration, people have moved directly to having mobile phones, for example. And it's also a technology, and feel free to get your mobile phones out at this point. You haven't touched them, have you? For at least half an hour. You're probably dying, aren't you, to just quickly, send something off to Facebook and check your emails. Do it, okay? It's really fine by me. That is the globital age. And if it rings, just pick it up, talk to your mate, order a pizza. It's really okay. Really, it is. The thing about the mobile phone is it's stuck to your body, okay? And when we did this research, we found that the last thing, and this is very sad, that people touch at night is their mobile phone. And it's the first thing that they touch in the morning. Prosaically, it's because it has an alarm function. Okay? But nevertheless, it's a bit sad, isn't it, that we're touching this technology as the first thing in the morning. And the other thing is that some of the women that we interviewed said that they kept their mobile phone actually under their pillow. And I couldn't initially figure out why, and I kept listening to these different interviews, and I found out that it was because of the torch function. The reason being that they had in mind that one of their children might wake up, and then they could see in the dark with their mobile phone. Okay, so again, fairly prosaic. But in terms of memory, there were some other interesting things that came out in the research. Again, in terms of the kind of positive aspects of this particular technology, mothers tended to say that what they found was that particularly girls tended to use the technology in quite interesting ways, in terms of kind of setting up little animations and so on, and using it in quite creative ways. And again, that actually surprised me. So one woman said, "We don't have many mirrors in our house, but my daughter, she takes photos of herself and makes little animations. She loves playing the videos back to herself. She hears her voice. I think the phone and the iPad is giving my daughter a greater sense of self." So let's just kind of remember what Freud said at the beginning and that other work that we saw at the beginning. Perhaps these technologies are that young girls are using these in quite positive ways. The other thing that's interesting is that the interviews seem to suggest that domestic and childcare activities are now being remembered in ways that hitherto they weren't within sort of public and family memory. Usually when you look at a photo album, there's kind of milestone events. There's birthdays, there are namings, there's Christmases, there's weddings. Not many funerals, actually. But then what also seems to happen with the mobile phone is that we kind of remember the mundane. Now, that might be a good thing or a bad thing, but if you're thinking about this from the perspective of gender, it means actually that those mundane things, which hitherto had not been given that much value, perhaps now have some kind of record. So Naomi Sadlin, for example, which was the kind of, I think it was the one, how to raise your children book that I actually got the hang of. I read loads and they were all useless. But this one said something very simple, which is that all you have to do is love your child, okay? Anyway, one of the things she says is, what I did at home seemed invisible and intangible. Perhaps my mothering was nothing after all. I only began to get the sense of having achieved something when our children were older. Then I could see that one by one, each vulnerable newborn had grown into a viable person. So many of the interviewees that I spoke to would mobilise, for example, images of a sleeping child. And it seems to me that that's a metonym for the end of a long day of parenting. Or they might mobilise through their mobile phones an image of the empty plate, which is a metonym for the meal shopped for, cooked and successfully fed to the baby or toddler. The everyday image of the child on the swing in the park, sent to the absent parent, is a metonym for that activity that may occur around the same time every day, and prior to mobile memories, it would have probably gone unrecorded within the public domain, in comparison, for example, with the special big trips. These are not the special public moments, the holidays, the namings, and the weddings. And it seems to me they provide new kinds of memories. The picture, by the way, is by my daughter, Afra. And this is Mummy Daddy. When the children were younger, Colin and I went part-time to look after sort of preschool children, and the school was a bit alarmed when they asked her about her family, and she did this sort of monstrous picture of Mummy Daddy, which was what she called us. She didn't have separate names for us because we kind of shared things together very much. So, and that's just to kind of counteract, actually, Naomi Stadlin's idea that it's the mother who mothers. There's plenty of fathers who mother and mothers who father. There's lots of switchings that go between. And the mobile phone also, it seems to me, is part of that process too. The other thing that particularly women said was I got that the mobile phone, they got their first decent mobile phone when they became pregnant. So I got my first mobile phone when I was probably 24, and I'm now 32. I have a small daughter. I started to have a smartphone when my daughter was born because I was alone with my child a lot, and I hadn't many people to contact, and so I'd be alone for around 10 hours. But I was busy with her, and the phone was like a portal to the outside world. If she was sleeping and I was wheeling her buggy, I could listen to music, I could read a book in the park while she was sleeping. But there's also a downside to this too, it seems to me, and most of the respondents, when we asked them how they might feel without their mobile phones, sometimes they said, oh, kind of a bit naked, but very often they said free. So this one woman says, if I lost my phone now, I would feel unconnected to my husband and the things that I have to do. Please buy some bread, and so on. But I think very quickly I would feel a sense of freedom. I wouldn't have to do all that. I think I would feel free of the pressure to be reachable all the time, free of the pressure to check it all the time. I think you always feel a bit occupied by the phone. Without the phone, you are much more on your own from a negative and positive side. And I wouldn't have Google Maps, so I'd have to find my way on my own. She uses the word occupied, and that really reminded me of George Orwell's 1984, the way in which technology now occupies us, occupies you from the inside out. And this research seems to suggest that in terms of your memories, it is occupying your memories in those particular ways. And we are allowing them, we are using them to occupy ourselves in those particular ways. But what happens then in the public sphere? So I've gone from the inside to the little bit of outside, very little home life. What happens in terms of publics? And I like to choose cheery subjects, so I just thought, oh, death. Let's do that. I did a number of case studies and of mobile witnessing of atrocity and terrorism. And what is interesting in terms of the gendering of the mobile witnessing of atrocity and terror is that there's a clear pattern that public memory assemblages of women that are mobilized in public discourse are generally secured around women as lacking in power. So it's women as victims yet again. And they tend to coalesce around women as innocent, as silent, and as dead. What then happens when you don't have a mobile phone image though? And I've chosen this one. You probably will remember it. It's the Situation Room image that was mobilized by the US state after the shooting dead of the Al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden. Now, they very clearly wanted to create a non-memory of that event. They only allowed certain people to see images of the corpse. And they put this image out of witnessing instead. And what was then really interesting was I then tracked, what happened to this image in terms of different sort of discursive battles that occurred with it, and some quite interesting hidden patterns. So in this particular newspaper, the women were removed. Okay, this was the front page of this particular newspaper. The image was mobilised in all sorts of interesting ways. Lego was used to reassemble the image. There was another image in which all the men were taken out and the women were left there. And my favourite, I like the reference to Wonder Woman. There are not many superheroes that are women, so I come back to Wonder Woman because I grew up with her. So what can be done then if we are occupied, in a sense, in this way, in terms of the memories of gender and gendering of memory? Lots can be done, and this is where you come in, okay? Where all of us come in. So I'm just going to outline very quickly a project that I was involved in with King's and with the theatre company Fuel Theatre, who have developed this amazing website which you can access, and you can take a card from the front at the end. And the point was to try to create a kind of website, a database of memories of phenomenal people. And they very deliberately use the word people because women are persons too. And you can go into this site and you can find out about all sorts of amazing women. And sometimes they're, somebody's mother, somebody's aunt, somebody's foster mother. Sometimes they're famous people, sometimes they're both, okay? And it's a really interesting website. But what it was also accompanied with, and I think this is important in the Globital age, is it was accompanied with live performance. So it's not simply about the digital, it's about this intersection of live performance with the digital, which it seems to me then enables us to be clothed with memory in the Globital age in a very different way that's more conscious, more active. So one of the things that they did was to decorate any theatre that they went to like a garden. They put down turf, they put down plants. The first performance was actually in the Anatomy Lecture Theatre at King's. Then they always had workshops, in the sort of tradition of John McGrath, in which they would get people to think about the kind of memories that were important to them. And then they had all sorts of theatre practitioners then putting forward very short performances within the digital garden that was part of this particular project. And I want to come to the end of this particular lecture by giving you an example of a performance that I did with them. And they asked me to develop a short piece because one of the things that I've kind of done throughout my academic career is continue my work as a playwright. I was one of the founder members of Strip Search Theatre in the 1980s. And that theatre work has always been really important to me. It's always accompanied my academic work. And I thought, well, I'll do a memory of a phenomenal woman. But the phenomenal person who kept coming to my mind was my daughter. And so I decided that I would write a letter to my daughter, which I'm going to read to you now. And Appa said that I have to wear the apron, okay? It's not ironed, I didn't have time. I don't know why, I can't imagine. So you can imagine this as part of a kind of general performance, okay? There's kind of lots going on. There's been about 6 other performances. It's rolling over the day. People can kind of come and go. This is just a little snippet, okay? To my dearest daughter, at 7, you tell me you and all girls and boys can and do be anything you want. And it will be the same when you are big and I am small. You tell me this with certainty and a sense of righteous indignation that I should even ask. And yet all the research says by 18, The majority of young women no longer think they can be Prime Minister, an astrophysicist, or simply be the glory that is themselves. At the moment, you are extraordinary. You wake up fully charged at 6 a.m, and by breakfast you've been a writer, a dog, and a scientist. You've built a rocket in the living room and flown to the far reaches of the universe while writing a volume of poetry and discovering the cure for cancer on your return. There is nothing to stop you. And yet, this is what I know for sure, that in 10 years' time, the world's wealth will still mostly belong to a minority of men, that violence against women will still be rife, that mass rape will continue to be at the heart of genocide and war, that more will be spent globally on military weapons and armies than all the money spent on health and education and refugees put together. And I know for sure that young women like you in wealthy countries like this will spend around 10 hours a day looking at screens, big, small, mobile, and probably some screen embedded into your wrist by that point, of which all of them will annihilate you every day with their absence of women and their depiction of women as sex objects in their various forms. I also know, my daughter, that your body will be a site of battle. There will be a public struggle over what you can and should wear. You will wear too little. You will wear too much. Your body will be too thin or too fat. Your hair will be too long or too short. The genitals of other girls will be mutilated. And while I don't know if by the year 2025 there will be a contraceptive pill for men, I know that getting pregnant, or indeed not getting pregnant, will be your fault. You will get pregnant too young or too old. You will go back to work too soon or too late. And I know then that you will work 17 times harder in whatever job you do to get on. But you will be the first to be fired. And I know then that you will begin to feel tired and wonder if all this is just you. And I know at first you may deny such gender inequality as something from the past, until you realise that you are not alone in what you feel, and you discover and reclaim yet again the stories and lives of women who tell you that you are not the first, and that this struggle has a history and memories to inspire you lasting thousands of years. And while I don't know what you as a young feminist in 2025 will believe is important, I would like to imagine that you will want a world where the 2010 law on historic sexual abuse that your mother's generation fought for really has made a difference, and girls and boys grow up without being sexually abused, a world where rapists receive 20 or 30 years group therapy in a secure environment. I imagine that you will want a world where half of all professors are women in all universities, whether in science or medicine and the arts, and that is normal. A world where parents, male and female, can and do take parental leave for at least a year, and where both men and women and employers support paid work part-time for parents to be with their children, if they choose. You, I would imagine, will also want a world where all girls can have a free education without intimidation, a world where the banks are half owned by women and all the world's parliaments and boardrooms are half filled with women. I would imagine that you would want healthy food and clean, accessible food and water for all. I don't know, but I would think you would want to see more equal shares of land, money, pensions, property and housing. I would imagine that you would want a world in which safe childbirth, in a place and manner of your choosing, is normal. But perhaps you will want more. Perhaps you will dance in front of drones, campaigning for the entire demilitarisation of the planet. Perhaps you will do a mass women's burrow to draw attention to the hidden rare earth mines essential for our digital gadgets that are part of the rape and pollution of our planet. Perhaps you will berate me for excluding the rights of non-human persons, the wisdom of dolphins, and the voices of 800-year-old sentient oak trees. Perhaps you will join with Indigenous Australians and call for the reburial of the uranium stolen from the land of the rainbow dragon serpent to fill the bellies of nuclear weapons. Perhaps you will call for an end to cloning, to the end of the server factories. Perhaps you are part of a DIY culture making the largest number of moon bags in the world, while sending personal postcards and handwritten letters as your own rebellion against what you see to be the tyranny of the digital. Yet I would also hope, my dearest daughter, that you will roundly reject for a time what you inherit from your mother and make your own path with as much energy, optimism, and rightful indignation at 17 and 70 as you have at the age of 7. Let this be so, not just for you, but for all the world's 7-year-old girls. Your loving mother, Amza, Anna Reading, a professor of cultural and creative industries at King's College, London, and a minor activist. Thank you. This is actually a little collage by my daughter, who, you can't quite see it on the corner there, but I said, that's wonderful. She said, it's my office, and I have my creche to the left of me here, so that I can just bring, she said she doesn't like dolls very much, but it's a furry rabbit, okay? So that she can bring her furry rabbit with her to work. That's the kind of ideal scenario, isn't it, that you can bring your furry rabbit with you to work. So just to finish then, one of my phenomenal women, who is a secret heroine of mine, not secret anymore because I'm letting you know it, is Mileva Maric. And Mileva Maric was the first wife of Albert Einstein. And she was also the first woman to be allowed to do a doctorate at the University of Zurich. She studied mathematics and physics. And she wrote this in a letter to her then lover, Albert Einstein. I don't think that the structure of the human skull is to be blamed for man's inability to understand the concept of infinity. He would certainly be able to understand it if, when young and while developing his sense of perception, he were allowed to venture out into the universe, rather than being cooped up on Earth, or worse yet, confined within the four walls in a provincial backwater. Now, the English translation here is, of course, androcentric, male-centred, but the point in Mileva Maric's now forgotten vision is that without memories and imaginaries of the whole universe of stories of women and men, human beings are stuck, going round the same eddies of a provincial backwater of unequal human development. So just imagine, instead of this provincial backwater of earthbound inequality, a future world in which women are allowed out into a globital universe of stories, in which girls and women are equally remembered in all their glory. Then imagine how even more extraordinary women and men would be on this ancient rock, travelling through trajectories of time and space. In coming here, you will not be able to forget that you are a human memory agent in your own right. And you can be part of that project for a full and equal universe of stories and memories. You have the agency to consciously tell gender-equal tales in all their forms, whether it's writing an academic book, making up a story for your children, posting an image to Facebook, tweeting a comment via Twitter. Use your power and your digital tools to imagine, fabricate, and to remember both men and women, boys and girls. And finally, do this not with some grand plan of permanently restoring equality in your lifetime, or forever gaining justice, or telling the absolute truth, or once and for all for being heard. No, go tell, go make, go fabricate. Stories in all their forms, so that momentarily there is equal human agency, which travels, sticks, transforms, breaks apart, and requires that you start yet again. And because this has been and will be a very, very long journey over millennia, you've been given a small keepsake to sustain you. Thank you very much.
I really think we should keep that applause going for a long time. Anna, that was really, it was such a special talk, and which invited us to do all sorts of things and to engage in all sorts of levels. And I'm really humbled and honored to be invited to give this vote of thanks, because I really genuinely do feel it, and I'm sure everyone in the room does as well. Before I just say a few words, and they really will just be a few words, I have two announcements to give you, which is, one is to please say to you that if you would like to take a photograph of your little imaginary woman in your moon bag and to email them to Anna, if you feel so inclined, please do so. And secondly is to say, at the end of these very brief comments, we are all invited to join Anna upstairs at a reception in Chapters, and everyone is really welcome to do that. So, and I know that we're very satiated here, and so I'll keep this very brief. But I'd like to just say a few thoughts, really, on the occasion itself. Contrary to what many people think, inaugural lectures do not really necessarily mark the beginning of a professorship, and clearly, as we know in Anna's case, it does not. Today, this ritual actually marks a tenure that's already been in place for some time. So temporally, the ritual, which is located in the present moment, is one which simultaneously looks back and looks forward. It combines celebration and promise. It's really a wonderful looking back to the future, as it were. And looking up the etymology of inauguration, this was actually really interesting for me. I learned that the word actually stems from a late 16th century Latin word, inaugurate, meaning, quote, and this is it, to take omens from the flight of birds, to consecrate or install when such omens are favorable. And I'm especially drawn to the image of the flight of birds, as I feel that that really resonates with what we have seen and heard tonight, and what we've been invited to collectively engage in. I can't help but be struck by a real sense of delight of being in this room tonight, even if one didn't already know Anna's work. Being invited to go to these many, many places of these imaginary women, and I made a list of all these incredible things that these Mummy, Daddy, and the Wonder Woman, and the letter to her daughter, mixed in with such real scholarship. This sort of weaving, which is very special and very characteristic of Anna's work, was really such a pleasure. And I would say that as a journalist, a playwright, a scholar, a feminist activist, Anna wears her many talents very lightly. Her work is infused with a sense of urgency and commitment, and it crackles with the energy of someone with true vision and purpose, and long may it be so. The word augur directing us to look forward, is what sits at the heart of Inauguration. Anna, the impressive scholarship and creativity which have characterized your career thus far indicates a very good omen for the flight of birds. And I wish you every success for the future, and thank you very much.